I want to pose a riddle to you today. I want you to imagine a population of tens of millions of people who have, well, by all historical metrics, just completely won the human development lottery.
Okay, that sounds like the exact outcome every developing nation is aiming for, right?
Right. I mean, over the last 30 years, they have added more than a decade to their lifespans.
Wow.
Yeah, and their health risks, specifically the ones, most likely to kill them in their youth, have just plummeted.
Then we're talking about massive biological resilience.
Exactly. And their time spent in the classroom has practically doubled to the point where they have entirely closed the historical education gap with their peers. So they're surviving, they're thriving, they are highly educated.
It sounds like an absolute triumph, like a total success story.
It does. But here is the punchline of the riddle. Economically and politically, this incredibly healthy, highly educated demographic is almost entirely invisible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They have won the game of survival, but they are entirely losing out on the dividends of that existence.
That is, I mean, that's a profound structural contradiction. It really forces us to rethink everything we assume about how society rewards human progress.
It really does. So today, our deep dive is unpacking exactly that. We are investigating a massive demographic reality that researchers are calling the South Asia Development Paradox.
Which is such a fascinating title.
It is. And our foundation for this conversation is it's a truly massive stack of data drawn from the 1990 to 2023 South Asia Human Development and Gender Justice In-Depth Research Report.
And we should let you know, this report is incredibly comprehensive. It covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, but I have to tell you, before we even get to the spreadsheets, the very first page of this report, it is just burned into my brain.
Oh, the visual design they chose to open with? Yeah, it's brilliant. It sets the stakes immediately.
It really does. You open the report, and it's just this stark, minimalist white page. Right in the center is this massive, bold, glaring red question mark.
Just right in your face.
Exactly. And right next to that question mark is a wildly counterintuitive statistic. It points out that women in South Asia, on average, have a biological survival premium of 3.4 years.
Meaning they outlive men by almost 3.5 years.
Right. Plus, their education years are catching up at this unprecedented speed, yet their share of the gross national income is only 32% of what men earn.
Less than a third.
Less than a third.
I mean, they are living longer, and as we'll explore, they're matching men in the classroom, but they are capturing just a fraction of the region's wealth.
Which is the core question inside that giant red question mark. Why? How do you win at survival but lose the world?
Well, to answer that, we have to look past the surface numbers today. We really have to dissect the structural machinery to understand why this, massive economic puzzle piece is just missing.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how you can win at life but lose the economy, we have to understand the baseline. Like, where did this all start?
Right, you need context.
Exactly, because if we look at the Human Development Index, the HDI, the region has actually been on this massive upward climb since 1990.
They have. It's undeniable progress.
But to really grasp what that climb means, we need to break down how this index actually works for you guys listening, because it's not just about money, is it?
No, not at all. So for decades, global economists just used gross domestic product, GDP,
Yeah.
as the ultimate scorecard for a country's success.
Which is just how much stuff are you making and selling?
Right. GDP is a really blunt instrument. It just tells you how much money is moving around. So the United Nations created the Human Development Index to move beyond that.
To measure actual human lives.
Exactly. The HDI combines 3 fundamental dimensions of human life into a single score between 0 and 1.
Okay, so what are the 3 dimensions?
First, a long and healthy life, which is measured by life expectancy. Second, access to knowledge, which is measured by years of schooling. And third, a decent standard of living, measured by per capita income.
So it's asking, are people actually living better, smarter, longer lives, not just, generating more corporate revenue?
Precisely. It's a measure of human flourishing rather than just economic output.
Okay, so looking at South Asia's HDI trajectory from 1990 to 2023, the raw numbers tell a really optimistic story. In 1990, the region's HDI was 0.454.
Which is what the UN classifies as low human development.
Right, very low. But by 2023, it had climbed to 0.672, so they officially moved into the medium human development category.
And that is a huge jump.
Yeah, that is a 48% increase in value over 30 years. And there's this little dip on the chart around 2021 where it falls to 0.641, which the report marks as the pandemic shock.
Right. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a global backslide, and South Asia definitely felt it.
But overall, 48% growth.
And we really shouldn't gloss over what a 48% increase actually means on the ground. Like a jump from 0.454 to 0.672 represents a generational transformation.
What does that look like practically?
It means millions of families transitioning from, absolute subsistence farming to the formal economy. It means dirt roads being paved, which allows people to actually access markets.
Oh, wow.
It
Yeah.
means rural clinics getting refrigeration for basic vaccines, grid electricity replacing dangerous kerosene lamps.
So it's life or death stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That mathematical jump is built on millions of individual lives being pulled out of sheer survival mode.
Which is amazing, but it makes the visual the report uses to illustrate this growth so confusing to me at first glance.
The snail.
Yes, the snail. They don't use a rocket ship taking off. They don't use an eagle soaring to represent this 48% growth. They literally use an infographic of a snail.
Yes, snail crawling up a slope.
Right, a snail slowly crawling up a slope, marking every 10 years, like 1990, 2000, 2010. Why a snail if the progress has been so monumental?
Because, well, development does not happen in a vacuum. It happens on a fiercely competitive global stage. South Asia is moving forward, absolutely.
Yeah.
But they are moving against a backdrop of a world that is just accelerating.
Ugh, okay. This is exactly the data point that stopped me in my tracks. Because in 2023, even with that shiny new 0.672 HDI score, South Asia ranks 141st out of 203 countries and regions globally.
Yeah. They are still stuck in the bottom 30% of the globe.
I genuinely struggled with this when I was reading the source material. I was like, if they have been climbing steadily for 3 straight decades, if the line on the graph is consistently going up, why are they still firmly at the bottom of the global pack?
It's a great question.
Like, are they making progress, but just in slow motion compared to everyone else?
That is precisely it. The rest of the world, particularly regions like East Asia and parts of Latin America, they experienced explosive, highly accelerated development during that exact same 30-year window.
So they're all racing.
Right. South Asia is jogging on a track where everyone else has started sprinting.
But wait, if they've paved the roads and built the schools and grown the economy by nearly 50%, why are they only jogging? Like, what is holding them back from sprinting like East Asia?
Well, it's not a lack of resources being generated. It's that a massive chunk of their progress is being actively siphoned off.
Siphoned off.
Yeah, it's essentially being stolen from the aggregate potential of the region.
Stolen? By what mechanism? Who is stealing it?
By deep systemic inequality.
Right.
And this is the inherent flaw of looking only at the standard HDI.
Because it's an average.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The HDI gives us an average. It tells us what the hypothetical average person experiences. But averages are dangerous.
How so?
Because if you have a billionaire living next to a family of 4 who are literally starving, the average wealth of that street looks fantastic.
Oh, right.
But the reality is a crisis. So to see the truth, the UN developed a secondary metric, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
Okay, let's slow down and unpack how the IHDI actually works, because this is crucial for you to understand the rest of the data. How does the UN mathematically adjust for inequality?
Think of it like taking a penalty on your score. The standard HDI looks at the total achievements in health, education, and income. The IHDI looks at how those achievements are distributed across the population.
I see.
If the distribution is perfectly equal, the HDI and the IHDI would be exactly the same number. But for every degree of inequality, for every billionaire hoarding resources while a rural farmer has nothing, the score is discounted. The greater the inequality, the lower the IHDI drops.
Okay, so let's apply that penalty to South Asia. The base HDI for 2023 is 0.672. But when you factor in the IHDI, when you penalize them for how unevenly that wealth and health is actually distributed, the score collapses.
It really does.
It drops all the way down to 0.469.
And that gap, the difference between what they could be at 0.672 and what they actually experience at 0.469 is what economists call the overall loss.
Overall loss.
Yeah. And in South Asia's case, that loss sits at an agonizing 30.2%.
30%. That is huge. The report illustrates this with a visual of a pie chart. It's this perfectly round pie representing the region's total development over the last 30 years, and nearly a full third of it is just sliced away.
It's gone.
It's gone.
That missing slice is the stolen dividend of development. It means that while the region as a whole is generating more wealth, building more advanced tech hubs, extending lifespans, those benefits are being aggressively captured by a very specific, privileged subset of the population.
Leaving everyone else behind.
Exactly. The broader masses are being left behind.
And the report gets incredibly specific about exactly where those leaks are happening. It breaks down the culprits of that 30.2% overall
Right,
loss.
the specific categories.
Yeah, so the distribution of education accounts for a 36.9% loss in their education index. And the distribution of income accounts for a 35.4% loss.
And what that translates to in the physical world is a starkly two-tiered society.
What do you mean?
Well, in cities like Mumbai or Dhaka, you have these highly affluent urban centers with world-class private education, booming tech sectors, and totally modern healthcare.
Right, very cosmopolitan.
But you travel 50 miles outside those city limits, and you hit rural populations where functional literacy is still a daily struggle, where schools lack basic sanitation, and agricultural incomes haven't meaningfully outpaced inflation in decades.
Jeez. You know what? When I was thinking about this, the analogy that came to mind wasn't a snail.
No.
No, it's more like carrying water in a leaky bucket.
Oh, I like that.
Think about it. The region is trying to fill this bucket of human development. Over 30 years, they have installed bigger pumps, they're generating more wealth, they are pumping far more water into the bucket than they did in 1990.
Right, the 48% increase.
Exactly. But because they haven't plugged the massive holes of educational and economic inequality, a full third of that water just immediately spills out onto the dirt.
That's a great way to put it.
No matter how hard they pump, the water level never reaches its actual potential.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the IHDI. The potential is there, but the structure is fundamentally compromised.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a critical pivot point in our deep dives today. Because to understand exactly who is slipping through the cracks of that leaky bucket, we have to transition from looking at general inequality to looking at the gender divide.
Okay.
We have to look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
Yeah.
And honestly, this is where the data plays a massive, confusing trick on the reader.
Oh my God, yes. This part of the report had me completely stumped. I had to read the GDI section like 3 times. Let's break this down for everyone.
Let's do it.
So the GDI essentially measures the gender gap in human development by comparing the HDI of women directly against the HDI of men.
Right, correct.
Okay, so in 1990, South Asia's GDI ranked 75th out of 77 countries that were measured globally.
It was an abysmal starting point. They were effectively at the very bottom of the global barrel for gender equality.
Right. But then you fast forward 30 years to 2023, their actual GDI value went up. It hit 0.72.
Yeah.
So their raw score vastly improved. But look at their global ranking for that same year. They fell to 173rd out of 194 countries.
Right, dropping to 173.
The report visualizes this paradox with 2 side-by-side trophies. The 1990 trophy is sitting high up on a pedestal, and the 2023 trophy is sitting way down near the floor, labeled Global Competitive Pressure.
And to a casual observer, looking at that ranking drop from 75 to 173, it looks like a catastrophic failure.
Absolutely.
It looks like South Asia actively moved backward.
That was my exact thought. I was like, if their raw score improved from 1990 to 2023, why did their ranking completely tank? Did conditions actually get worse for women while the score somehow artificially inflated?
No, conditions did not get worse. What happened is what we can call the treadmill effect.
The treadmill effect.
Yeah. Imagine South Asia walking on a treadmill. For 30 years, they are putting one foot in front of the other. They are making undeniable forward progress relative to their own starting position in 1990.
Okay, so they are moving.
They are moving. But over those same 3 decades, the global conversation and implementation of gender equality didn't just walk. It started sprinting.
So South Asia was power walking, but Europe and Latin America put on running shoes and cranked the treadmill speed to max.
Precisely. You saw massive systemic policy shifts in other parts of the world. Nordic countries completely revolutionized parental leave and childcare. Latin American nations introduced sweeping political quotas for women.
Wow, yeah.
East Asia integrated women into the industrial workforce at an unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
So when the global competition for gender equality accelerated, South Asia's rate of improvement simply couldn't keep pace.
That makes total sense.
So yes, they have equality on paper, and they are much better off than they were in 1990, but they suffered a severe lag in global reality.
So they're constantly improving, but they're constantly falling further behind the global standard at the same time. That sounds incredibly discouraging.
It does, if you only look at the aggregate global ranking. But what's fascinating here is if you start comparing them to Norway or Canada, and you start looking closely at the specific granular components of women's lives inside South Asia over those 30 years,
changes the picture.
It reveals absolute miracles hidden within that global lag.
Okay, this is the turning point of the data. Because when we isolate specific metrics within the GDI, specifically education and sheer biological survival, the narrative of failure completely shatters. Let's look at what the region actually got right.
And we really must emphasize that the demographic transformation of the South Asian woman over a single generation is one of the most profound, rapid social shifts in modern human history.
Okay, let's start with the classroom. The specific metric the UN uses is expected years of schooling, or EYS.
Right.
In 1990, a girl born in South Asia could expect to receive, on average, exactly 6.2 years of formal schooling.
Just 6 years.
6 years. That basically means she finishes primary school, maybe learns fundamental reading and basic arithmetic, and her education is just permanently over.
And we have to compare that to the boys in 1990 to see the structural disadvantage.
Yeah, let's look at the boys. The boys in 1990 had an expected 9.1 years of schooling. So right out of the gate, before they even reach adolescence, there is a massive 3-year gender gap in fundamental education.
And that 3-year gap isn't just about reading books.
No.
No, it is a gap that dictates lifetime earning potential. It dictates maternal health outcomes. It dictates a woman's autonomy and bargaining power within her future marriage.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, a 3-year deficit at that young age sets the trajectory for permanent secondary status.
But then we roll the clock forward to 2023. The expected years of schooling for females skyrocketed to 11.9 years.
These nearly double their time in the education system.
Nearly doubled. That is a 92.4% growth rate in a single generation. The report circles this 2023 number with a huge upward arrow, and here's the kicker. The males in 2023 are at 12.2 years.
So the gap has essentially vanished.
Vanish.
We are talking about statistical parity in the classroom.
They went from a devastating 3-year deficit to trailing by just a few months. How does a society achieve a 92% growth rate in female education in 30 years? Like, that can't just be about building more brick-and-mortar schools, can it?
No, it's not. The physical infrastructure is actually the easiest part.
Really?
Yeah. What we're seeing here is the triumph of an immense cultural machinery. To double the years a girl spends in school, you have to completely re-engineer the socioeconomic incentives of millions of families.
What do you mean by re-engineering the incentives?
Well, in 1990, for a family living in subsistence poverty, a daughter's time was highly valuable, but not in a classroom.
Where was it valuable?
Her time was needed to fetch water, to gather firewood, to care for younger siblings, or to work in the agricultural fields.
Ah, I see.
To keep her in school for 12 years requires a massive cultural shift, where a father decides her mind is a better long-term investment than her immediate physical labor.
That is a huge paradigm shift.
It is. And it also requires highly targeted government interventions. We are talking about initiatives like providing free midday meals to incentivize attendance, or giving families direct cash transfers if their daughter maintains an 80% attendance rate.
Wow, so they are literally paying the families to keep the girls in school.
Exactly.
You know, I read somewhere that one of the biggest drivers of keeping teenage girls in school in developing nations is just building separate, safe latrines.
Absolutely. That is huge. Lack of sanitation facilities means girls simply drop out when they hit puberty and begin menstruating.
Because there's nowhere safe for them to go.
Right. So building a private bathroom in a rural school is literally an educational revolution. All of these interventions, the meals, the cash, the bathrooms, they compounded over 30 years to create this monumental shift in the value placed on a woman's intellect.
That is just incredible. And the miracles don't stop at education. We have to talk about the survival premium.
Right. The biological resilience.
Yeah. The thing we hinted at with the riddle at the very beginning of the show, let's look at life expectancy at birth. In 1990, a woman in South Asia could expect to live to 59.5 years old.
She wasn't even making it to her 60th birthday.
Which is an unspeakable tragedy of lost human potential. But by 2023, that number jumps to 73.6 years.
A massive leap.
And men, for comparison, are at 70.2 in 2023. The report has this beautiful, subtle visual in the background of this section. It looks like an ECG heartbeat line.
Oh, I remember that graphic.
Yeah, and when you look closely, it's actually 2 distinct lines, one for men, one for women. You see the lines starting relatively close together in 1990, and then as they move across the graph toward 2023, the female line extends further out and the gap between them visibly widens.
Showing that the women are fundamentally outlasting the men.
Exactly. And as analysts, we have to ask the mechanical question, why? Why did women suddenly gain 14 years of life expectancy in a single generation?
It is largely because the region systematically smoothed out what we can grimly call the speed bumps of female health.
Speed bumps. Oh, you mean the specific, highly lethal risks associated entirely with being a woman in a developing nation?
Yes. And the data here is perhaps the most life-affirming part of the entire 30-year report.
I want to read these numbers carefully to you because they are staggering. The maternal mortality ratio, the MMR, which measures how many mothers die for every 100,000 live births, was terrifying in 1990. It was 516.7. That means over 500 women were dying for every 100,000 babies born. But by 2023, that number plummeted to 131.75.
That is a drop of over 74%.
74%.
And when you scale that per 100,000 ratio across the massive population of South Asia, you have to stop and think about the human reality.
The actual lives saved.
Right. That represents hundreds of thousands of mothers who didn't bleed to death or die of preventable infections. Hundreds of thousands of mothers who survived to raise their children, to mentor the next generation, and to contribute to their communities.
It gives me chills, honestly. And tied directly to maternal survival is the adolescent birth rate, the ABR.
Another critical metric.
In 1990, there were 135 births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. By 2023, that shrank to 26.1. Wow. The visual in the report uses two shrinking funnels. A massive wide funnel for 1990 demonstrating how many young lives were caught in the trap of early pregnancy, and a tight, narrow funnel in 2023.
And this is where we really have to connect the dots of all these statistics. None of these miracles happened in isolation.
They didn't.
No, they form a deeply interconnected virtuous cycle. Think about it. Why is the adolescent birth rate dropping from 135 to 26?
Because they are in school.
Because, exactly as we just discussed, the expected years of schooling jumped to nearly 12 years. If a 16-year-old girl is in high school studying for exams, she is significantly less likely to be married off in a traditional arrangement.
Right. And why is maternal mortality dropping by 74%?
Because of that exact same delay. Women are now having their first children in their 20s when their bodies are biologically mature enough to handle the trauma of childbirth rather than at 15.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Furthermore, because they have 12 years of education, they are literate. They can read public health pamphlets. They understand the necessity of seeking professional prenatal care rather than relying solely on traditional, sometimes unsafe, village practices.
The education fuels the health, and the health fuels the survival.
It is an incredible triumph.
It is. So let me paint the picture of where we are at right now in our analysis. We are looking at South Asia in 2023. We have a demographic of tens of millions of women who are highly educated, standing at parity with men in the classroom. They are surviving childbirth. They are delaying pregnancy. They are living deep into their 70s, outliving men by 3.5 years.
It is the biological and educational lottery fully realized.
Right. So the ultimate logical assumption any rational person would make looking at this data is, well, where are they working?
Right. Where are the jobs?
If you have this army of healthy, educated, long-living women, they must be an unstoppable economic engine. They must be completely transforming the workforce and dominating the modern economy.
And here is where our diagnostic machine breaks down completely. Here is where we hit the paradox.
I'm going to drop the bombshell data point that completely shatters the optimistic narrative we just spent the last 20 minutes building.
Brace yourselves.
Let's look at the labor force participation rate, the LFPR. This is the percentage of the working age population that is actively working or actively looking for work in the formal economy.
Okay.
In 2023, for men in South Asia, the participation rate is 76.7%. For women, it is 33.5%.
It is less than half the rate of men.
It's completely mind-boggling. They have 12 years of schooling, but a staggering 2/3 of them are completely absent from the formal labor force.
2/3.
And if you look closely at the trend line, it gets scarier. There is a terrifying anomaly in the data just a few years ago. In 2018, before the pandemic even started to disrupt global markets, female labor participation in South Asia plummeted to a staggering 22.5%.
Barely 1 in 5 women were working.
Barely 1 in 5. So what does this all mean? Like, why on earth would female labor participation drop to 22.5% in 2018 when education was rising?
Well, this specific phenomenon is what economists and sociologists working in the region refer to as the dead knot of South Asian development.
A dead knot. Like a knot pulled so tight you can't find a way to untie it.
Exactly. And to understand the 2018 anomaly, we have to talk about a fascinating and tragic economic phenomenon known as the U-shaped curve of female labor participation.
The U-shaped curve. What's that?
Okay, so in conditions of extreme absolute poverty, female labor participation is actually quite high. Women have to work in the agricultural fields or do harsh manual labor just so the family doesn't starve.
Right, survival dictates it.
But as a developing economy starts to grow,
Mhm.
as South Asia did in the 2000s and 2010s, and families move from absolute poverty into the lower middle class, the first thing a patriarchal society does with that new wealth is pull women out of the workforce.
Wait, why? Because it's a status symbol.
Exactly. The societal narrative becomes, I am finally successful enough as a husband that my wife doesn't have to break her back in the fields. Keeping women at home becomes a marker of middle-class respectability.
Wow.
The labor participation only goes back up, completing the right side of the U-shape, when the economy modernizes enough to offer safe, high-status white-collar jobs that society deems appropriate for educated women.
So 2018 was the bottom.
Yes. 2018 represents the trough, the very bottom of that U-curve, for massive swaths of the South Asian population.
That is endlessly fascinating. It completely upends the traditional Western model of development.
It really does.
Because the Western assumption is that education is a straight line to economic participation. You educate a girl, she gets a degree, she applies for a job, she gains the economic independence. That is the blueprint.
Right, that's the standard assumption.
But South Asia proves that education is necessary, but wholly insufficient on its own.
Because while the society educated the women, it didn't build the infrastructure or dismantle the cultural barriers required to actually absorb them into the workforce. To understand the dead knot, we have to pull on its individual threads. The structural barriers are immense, and they compound each other.
Okay, let's pull those threads. What is keeping a woman with 12 years of education at home?
Well, the thickest thread is the care economy, the unpaid domestic labor. The burden of caring for children, for aging parents, for cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the household falls almost entirely on women.
And that's everywhere, right?
It's a globally recognized issue, absolutely. But in South Asia, the disparity is extreme. An educated woman cannot realistically work a 9-to-5 job in an office if there is no socialized childcare, and if her husband and extended family expect her to fulfill 100% of the domestic duties.
Right. The unpaid labor is a grueling, invisible full-time job in itself. You can't add a 40-hour work week on top of a 60-hour domestic work week.
Precisely. And the second thread is occupational segregation and systemic bias. Even with degrees, women are often culturally steered toward a very narrow band of professions like teaching or nursing, while high-paying sectors like engineering, finance, or heavy industry remain male-dominated clubs with deeply entrenched bias.
So they are locked out of the lucrative fields.
And if a married woman pursues a high-powered career, she often faces severe cultural stigma.
Because, tying back to the U-curve, an educated woman out-earning her husband is viewed as a threat to traditional gender roles.
Exactly. So the education is often viewed by the society not as a tool for female economic independence, but as a status symbol to secure a better marriage prospect.
Really?
Yeah, it's a way to say, my daughter is educated enough to tutor her future children, rather than my daughter is educated enough to be a CEO.
That is a tough pill to swallow.
And the third thread of the dead knot is deeply practical and physical.
Yeah.
It's about mobility and safety.
Meaning transportation.
Let's say a woman overcomes the domestic burden and the cultural stigma. She still has to physically get to work. In many rapidly expanding South Asian megacities, public transport is chronically overcrowded, poorly lit, and largely unsafe for women.
Oh, man.
If a woman has to take 3 different buses across a chaotic city to get to a job that pays her 30% less than a man anyway, the family's cost-benefit analysis is going to result in her staying home. The society educated her mind, but it refused to make the physical world safe for her body to navigate.
And when you pull all those threads together, that dead knot results in the most jarring financial statistic in the whole report. We have to look at the income chasm.
Let's look at the numbers.
Let's look at the gross national income, GNI, per capita. For men in South Asia in 2023, the GNI is 12,996 scales. For women, it is an abysmal 4,246 scales.
And the visual the report uses for this is a wildly tilted scale.
The scale is completely broken. Male income is 3.06 times higher than female income.
But, I want to push back on our own methodology here because our listeners who follow global economics are probably screaming this at their speakers right now.
What are they screaming?
When we see a gap of 12,996 flowers versus $4,246, are these women truly not working, or are we just using a broken metric that refuses to count their work?
Ah, that is a phenomenal question, and it cuts to the heart of the critique of global economics. Gross national income only measures the formal economy.
Right.
It measures work that generates a paycheck, pays taxes, and gets recorded by a bank.
Right, the official stuff.
But tens of millions of women in South Asia are working in the informal economy. They are working on family-owned subsistence farms, they are weaving textiles at home, they are running unregulated street stalls, and, as we discussed, they are performing billions of hours of uncompensated domestic and care labor.
So they are working. They are working incredibly hard. They are the backbone of the society's survival. But because that labor isn't formalized into a salary, the macroeconomic data treats them as zeros. It renders them economically invisible.
Wow. They are subsidizing the entire economy with their invisible labor, allowing the men to go out and generate the formal $12,996, while they are credited with only $4,246.
Exactly. But we must be clear, even if we acknowledge the flaw in the metric, the reality of that 4,246 badger figure is still devastating.
Why?
Because why does that income gap matter? It isn't just about consumer buying power. It's about autonomy. This extreme tilt in formalized economic power is the core driver of South Asia's high gender inequality index, the GII.
Okay, explain that.
Because the brutal truth of human history is that you cannot have social power without economic power.
If you don't control the purse strings, if you don't have your own bank account, you fundamentally do not control your own destiny.
Precisely. When women do not have independent formalized income, they have drastically reduced bargaining power within their own households. They have less say in major financial decisions, they have less say in their own health care, and they have less say in whom their children marry.
That's terrifying.
Their 12 years of education and their 73 years of life expectancy are effectively trapped inside an economic dependency.
And if you don't have economic power, if you don't have a voice in your own living room, it becomes geometrically more difficult to get a seat at the table where the actual macro-level rules of society are made. Which brings us to the glass ceiling, the political arena.
Yes, political representation is the ultimate downstream effect of the economic dead knot.
The data on this is sobering. Let's look at the halls of power. The report tracks the share of parliamentary seats held by women across the region. In 1990, it was practically non-existent, a mere 5.8%.
Very low.
By 2023, it has grown, which is good, but it has only reached 17.9%. I tried to visualize this while reading. Imagine a massive grand parliament hall with 100 seats representing the entire population.
Okay, 100 seats.
Over 4 out of every 5 seats in that room are occupied by men. There are only 17 or 18 women in the entire room trying to shout over 82 men.
And we have to ask why that ceiling is so thick. Politics everywhere in the world requires capital. It requires vast networks of influence, it requires physical mobility to campaign, and it requires social clout.
And women don't have that capital.
Right. If women are systematically sidelined from the formal economy, if they are trapped in the unpaid care economy, they simply cannot amass the financial and social resources required to run for national office and win.
And what happens when those 18 women are drowned out? What happens to the country when the parliament is 82% male?
The policies required to break the economic dead knot simply never get drafted. Think about it logically. Who is going to fight tooth and nail on the parliament floor for massive national budgets for subsidized public childcare?
Not the 82 men.
Exactly. Who is going to prioritize spending billions on safe, well-lit, heavily policed public transport specifically designed for female commuters? Who is going to draft and violently enforce legislation protecting women from workplace harassment?
Right.
Without a critical mass of female voices in decision-making, the status quo remains incredibly comfortable for the men holding the power.
It's a devastating, self-reinforcing trap. You desperately need political power to force changes in the economy, but you need economic power to buy your way into political power.
It's a vicious cycle.
And while we are talking about traps, we have to talk about the absolute bottom floor of this data, because even with the HDI climbing, even with the snail making progress, there is a darkness at the bottom of these statistics that we cannot ignore.
You are referring to the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
Right. The data shows that 20.0% of the population in South Asia remains in multidimensional poverty, and the poverty intensity is measured at 45.4%. Can you comprehensively unpack the MPI for us? Because it sounds like it means something much deeper than just not having money.
Oh, it absolutely is. The Multidimensional Poverty Index is arguably the most important metric for understanding the true lived reality of the most vulnerable. It recognizes that poverty isn't just a lack of cash.
What else is?
It's not just living on less than $2 a day. It is about overlapping compounding deprivations. The MPI looks at a household and measures 10 specific indicators across health, education, and living standards.
What kind of indicator?
It asks, does this home have a dirt floor? Do they rely on burning dung or wood for cooking fuel? Do they have access to clean drinking water within a 30-minute walk? Is there a child in the home who is malnourished? Has anyone in the family completed 5 years of school?
Those are very basic needs.
Right. If a household is deprived in a third or more of these indicators, they are classified as multidimensionally poor.
So when the report says the poverty headcount is 20%, it means 1 in 5 people in South Asia are living with these overlapping deprivations.
Yes.
But what does that second number mean? The poverty intensity of 45.4%.
The intensity measures how poor the poor actually are. An intensity of 45.4% means that, on average, a poor person in South Asia isn't just missing 1 or 2 basic needs. They are deprived in nearly half of all the fundamental indicators simultaneously.
Oh my God.
They don't have a floor,
Yeah.
and they don't have clean water, and they are burning toxic fuel.
So while the HDI paints a picture of this growing, modernizing middle class, 1 in 5 South Asians are still completely in the dark. But how does this specifically tie back to our focus on women?
Because multidimensional poverty is profoundly gendered. When a household lacks basic infrastructure, the burden of bridging that gap falls entirely on women.
It does.
Think about the indicators. If a household lacks clean cooking fuel and relies on gathering firewood, whose job is it to spend 4 hours a day walking into the forest to gather that wood? It is women and girls. And who is breathing in the toxic smoke from the open fire while cooking?
The women.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a household lacks indoor plumbing, who spends hours every morning walking to a distant well to carry heavy jugs of water back home? Women and girls. Multidimensional poverty literally steals the time, the caloric energy, and the respiratory health of women first. It anchors them physically to the household.
It is a physical tether that makes entering the formal economy literally impossible, regardless of how many years of schooling they technically achieved.
Right.
And as South Asia desperately tries to pull that 20% out of poverty, as it tries to build the power plants and the water infrastructure to free those women, the region is violently bumping into a very modern, very planetary limit.
Yes, the environmental discount.
This brings us to a metric I wasn't deeply familiar with before diving into this research. The PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
It is a relatively new metric from the UN, and it is vital for understanding the future. It takes the standard Human Development Index score and actively penalizes it based on the country's carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint per capita.
Let's look at the penalties South Asia is taking. In 2023, per capita CO2 emissions in the region reached 2.1 tons. When you adjust their development score for the pressure this carbon puts on the planet, it shaves 4.17% off South Asia's total development score.
It's a significant discount.
And what's truly alarming is the historical trend. Back in 1990, the environmental penalty was only 2.2%.
The penalty has nearly doubled as their economy has grown.
So what is the real cost of development here?
The true cost is that South Asia is trying to solve its economic and gender paradoxes, while the global planetary budget is essentially bankrupt.
Right. They are trying to industrialize now when the atmosphere is already full.
And we have to acknowledge the immense global hypocrisy here. When Europe and North America industrialized in the 19th and 20th centuries, when they built the massive middle-class wealth that eventually funded their own gender equality movements, they did it by burning cheap, dirty coal with absolute impunity.
Yeah, they didn't have carbon budgets.
Right, they filled the atmosphere with carbon to build their societies. South Asia is trying to build its middle class today. They need to generate cheap electricity to free women from burning firewood. But they're being told they cannot follow the exact 20th century industrial blueprint the West used.
It's incredibly unfair.
It is. And if they ignore that warning and burn the coal anyway, the climate impacts, the catastrophic monsoon floods, the lethal wet bulb heat waves, the collapse of agricultural yields will hit South Asia first and hardest.
And who suffers the highest mortality rates and the most severe economic displacement during a climate disaster? The poorest demographics, which, as we've just seen, disproportionately means women.
Exactly. So South Asia is caught in this incredibly tight, almost impossible bind. They have to grow their economy massively to absorb these tens of millions of educated women, but they have to do it using green technologies and sustainable practices that are often significantly more expensive, require complex intellectual property from the West, and are much harder to scale quickly. It is an unprecedented historical challenge.
Okay, we have painted a remarkably daunting picture today. We've talked about the leaky bucket of inequality, the brutal dead knot of the care economy, the U-shaped curve of labor, and the suffocating planetary limits.
It's a lot to take in.
If we stopped here, this would be a deeply pessimistic deep dive. But the data doesn't end on a note of despair. There's a tectonic shift happening, particularly hidden in the data from the last 3 or 4 years.
The post-pandemic data from 2020 to 2023 is arguably the most surprising and debated part of the entire research report.
Let's look at the rebound. We are focusing just on the incredibly tight window from 2019 to 2023. We all know the pandemic caused a massive global backslide in human development.
Everywhere felt it.
South Asia was not immune. Their HDI dipped to 0.641 in 2021. But by 2023, it didn't just recover, it bounced back to 0.672, completely beating the pre-pandemic 2019 high of 0.645.
In macroeconomic terms, that shows remarkable systemic resilience. The fundamental infrastructure of the region held together.
But here's the data point that changes everything. Remember that terrifying labor force participation valley we discussed, where female participation hit 22.5% in 2018?
The very bottom of the U-curve. Yeah.
And even in 2022, as the pandemic faded, it was still languishing at 28.6%. But look at 2023. Female labor participation made a massive, violent leap to 33.5%.
That's incredible.
If you look at the graph, it is a sharp, undeniable V-shaped bounce back. A nearly 5 percentage point jump in a single year across a massive global region is statistically wild.
It is a critical data point, and it has economists fiercely debating its underlying cause. The debate essentially centers on one question. Is this a permanent paradigm shift, or is it a distress response?
Distress versus empowerment. Let's unpack both sides.
The empowerment argument suggests that the post-pandemic, the sudden global normalization of remote work, gig economies, and digital entrepreneurship finally allowed educated South Asian women to bypass the physical barriers.
Well, it's because they don't have to commute.
Right. They didn't need safe public transport. They needed a laptop. It suggests the culture finally cracked open to allow them to participate for the safety of their homes.
Okay, that sounds really positive. And the distress argument?
The distress argument is much darker. It suggests that the crushing post-pandemic global inflation, the rising cost of food and fuel, put such immense pressure on South Asian families that the traditional patriarchal pride simply broke.
Oh, no.
The husband's single salary was no longer enough to prevent starvation. So women were forced into the labor market, often accepting low-paying, highly exploitative informal jobs, purely as a survival mechanism.
So they didn't enter the workforce because the glass ceiling broke. They entered because the floor was falling out from under them.
Exactly. But here's the crucial sociological takeaway. Regardless of the initial trigger, whether it was digital empowerment or inflationary distress, the undeniable fact is that millions of women are now actively engaged in the labor force who weren't a year prior.
Right, they are working now.
And history shows us that once a demographic crosses that barrier, once women begin generating income and experiencing that agency, it is incredibly difficult to force them back into the domestic box.
Yeah.
It can initiate permanent cultural change.
The report closes with a final, overarching framework to help us synthesize all of this complex data. They use a visual of interlocking gears. It's a map of South Asia, constructed entirely of mechanical gears, and the central, most vital gear in the mechanism is labeled the female gear.
It's a powerful metaphor.
And the illustration implies that this gear is finally being accelerated.
This gear framework represents what must be the fundamental paradigm shift for the region over the next 30 years.
How does that shift work conceptually?
Think of South Asia's development as an equation with two distinct sides. If you look at the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, South Asia was entirely focused on solving the left side of the equation.
Which is what?
Survival, health, education, getting girls to live past infancy, stopping them from dying in childbirth, and keeping them in a classroom for 12 years. And as the data shows, they have largely succeeded. That side of the equation is remarkably close to being solved.
The biological and educational lottery has been won.
Yes, but the monumental challenge for the next 30 years is the right side of the equation: economic empowerment, political participation, the fair distribution of wealth.
That's the hard part.
Very hard. South Asia has proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it has the capacity to dramatically improve the quality and longevity of its population. The next era is exclusively about allowing that population to actually exercise power.
They have to finally untie the dead knot.
They have no choice. They need to turn that 33.5% labor participation rate into 50% and then 60%. They need to turn the 17% in parliament into 30% and then parity.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, the leaky bucket of inequality will continue to drain the region's immense potential, and the compounding planetary pressures of climate change will lock the remaining 20% in permanent, multidimensional poverty.
We started this deep dive with a riddle. We talked about a massive demographic that won the game of survival but lost the economy. And as we wrap up this journey from the snail's pace of the initial HDI climb to the incredible paradigm-shifting leaps in female education, and finally to those stubborn, frustrating knots holding back economic and political power, I want to leave you with a lingering thought.
It's a lot to process.
It is. South Asia has successfully educated a massive generation of women. We are talking about tens of millions of brilliant individuals who are healthy, who possess 12 years of formal schooling, and who will live well into their 70s.
Tens of millions.
But what happens to a society when tens of millions of highly educated, healthy women are kept waiting in the wings of the economy? Historically, when that much human potential, that much intellect, and that much energy is bottled up and denied a seat at the table,
it doesn't stay quiet.
No, it doesn't just quietly fade away. It doesn't remain dormant. It builds pressure. And eventually, whether through slow cultural erosion or rapid systemic shock, it reshapes the entire world.
It's going to be fascinating to watch.
It really is. Keep your eyes on South Asia. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.